They burned the libraries, they renamed the cities, they redrew the maps. For centuries, the most powerful empires the world had ever seen were buried beneath someone else's story. But history has a long memory, and tonight the record is corrected. When European colonizers arrived on the African continent in the 15th century and beyond, they did not just take land, they took something more dangerous. They took the narrative. Scholars were dismissed, monuments were attributed to foreign civilizations, oral traditions were labeled myth, and entire empires, some of the largest and wealthiest the world had ever known, were quietly removed from the pages of global history. What you are about to witness is not legend, it is not mythology. Every civilization in this documentary existed. Every name, every date, every conquest documented, excavated, and verified. These are the 7 African empires they tried to erase, and they failed. If this is the kind of history that has been kept from you, and it has, then subscribe right now. Hit that bell, because this channel exists for one reason, to put the record straight. Stay until the end, because the 7th empire on this list may be the most shocking suppression of all. In the year 1324, a man set out from West Africa on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He traveled with an entourage of 60,000 men and 500 servants. He carried 80 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was the ruler of the Mali Empire, by most historical estimates, the wealthiest individual who has ever lived on this planet. The Mali Empire rose to dominance in the 13th century, founded by Sundiata Keita, a warrior king who united the Mandinka people and overthrew the Soso kingdom at the Battle of Kirina in 1235. What followed was the construction of one of the most sophisticated states in medieval history. At its peak, the Mali Empire controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, the economic arteries of the medieval world, commanding the flow of gold, salt, ivory, and copper across 3 continents. The city of Timbuktu became the intellectual capital of the known world. The Sankore Madrasa, founded in the 14th century, hosted over 25,000 students and housed a collection of over 1 million manuscripts, texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law that predated the European Renaissance. When Mansa Musa passed through Cairo in 1324, he distributed so much gold that he crashed the Egyptian economy for 12 years. Contemporary Arab scholars documented his journey in detail. Yet somehow, in centuries of Western historiography, this empire was reduced to a footnote when it was mentioned at all. The Mali Empire declined in the 15th century under internal succession struggles and the rising power of the Songhai to the east, but at its height it covered an area larger than Western Europe, governing a population of some 40 million people, with a legal system, a civil service, and an army that commanded fear across the Saharan trade world. There are more ancient pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. That single fact has the power to rewrite everything a person thinks they know about African history. The Kingdom of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan, arose in the region of Nubia around 2500 BCE, contemporary with the early Egyptian pharaohs. For centuries, Kush and Egypt traded, warred, and intertwined. But in 744 BCE, the balance of power shifted dramatically. A Kushite king named Pe marched north and conquered all of Egypt. For nearly a century, from 747 to 656 BCE, a dynasty of black African pharaohs, what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty, ruled the most powerful civilization in the ancient world. These pharaohs, Pe, Shabaka, Taharka, and their successors were not conquerors who dismantled what they found. They were restorers. They rebuilt decayed temples. They revived old religious traditions that Egypt itself had abandoned. Taharka, in particular, is mentioned in the Bible, in the Book of Kings and the Book of Isaiah, as a significant regional power who stood against the Assyrian Empire.
After being driven from Egypt by the Assyrians, the Kushites returned south and built a civilization at Meroe that would last another 1,000 years. They developed their own written script, Meroic, which has still not been fully deciphered. They built hundreds of pyramids. They developed an iron smelting industry so advanced that Meroe is sometimes called the Birmingham of Africa by modern archaeologists. The Kingdom of Kush endured to approximately 350 CE. Its erasure from popular history was methodical. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, Western scholars debated whether the Kushite pharaohs were truly African, suggesting instead that they were of Mediterranean or Middle Eastern origin, a claim that decades of skeletal and genetic analysis have since completely dismantled. At its height in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Songhai Empire was the largest empire in African history. It covered approximately 1.4 million square kilometers, encompassing modern-day Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and beyond. Its population numbered in the tens of millions. Songhai rose from the ashes of the Mali Empire, accelerated by the extraordinary leadership of Sunni Ali, who came to power in 1464 and spent the next 28 years in almost constant military campaign, capturing Timbuktu in 1468 and Djenné in 1473. After Sunni Ali, Askia Muhammad came to power in 1493 and transformed the empire from a military state into an administrative and intellectual powerhouse. Askia Muhammad standardized weights and measures across the empire. He established a professional bureaucracy with ministers, tax collectors, and regional governors. He maintained diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire and the kingdoms of North Africa. Under his rule, Timbuktu's universities flourished as never before, drawing scholars from across the Muslim world. The destruction came from the north. In 1591, the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur sent an army of 4,000 soldiers across the Sahara, armed with gunpowder weapons the Songhai had never encountered, and defeated the Songhai forces at the Battle of Tondibi. It was one of the most consequential military engagements in African history. The Moroccan force was smaller but technologically superior, and within months the Songhai administrative structure had collapsed. What followed was deliberate erasure. Moroccan occupiers arrested Timbuktu's leading scholars and deported them to Marrakesh. Libraries were dispersed. The institutional knowledge of centuries was scattered to the wind. The Songhai Empire never recovered, and its legacy, like its libraries, was buried.
In the 1870s, when European explorers first encountered the ruins of a massive stone city in southern Africa, their response was not wonder, it was denial. The structures they found, dry stone walls 11 meters high, built without mortar, enclosing an area of nearly 800 hectares, were, according to the consensus of colonial scholars, simply too advanced to have been built by Africans. They proposed the Phoenicians built it, then the Arabs, then the ancient Israelites. One colonial writer even suggested the ruins were connected to the Queen of Sheba. The idea that the indigenous Shona people of Zimbabwe had constructed one of the most impressive architectural achievements in sub-Saharan Africa was, for decades, officially suppressed. The Rhodesian government actually censored archaeologists who published findings attributing the site to local African civilizations. The truth, confirmed by archaeological excavation spanning the 20th century, is straightforward. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, beginning around the 11th century CE and reaching its peak between the 13th and 15th centuries. At its height, it was a city of between 10,000 and 18,000 people, one of the largest urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa at that time. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a sophisticated trading state that controlled the gold trade between the interior of Africa and the Swahili coast ports, through which goods flowed to Arabia, India, and China.
Excavations have uncovered Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, and Arab glassware within the ruins, evidence of a city deeply embedded in Indian Ocean trade networks. The name Zimbabwe itself derives from the Shona phrase meaning houses of stone. The nation that gained independence in 1980 took its name from these ruins as an act of deliberate reclamation, a direct repudiation of the century of colonial denial that had surrounded them. At the time of its greatest power, the Aksumite Empire was considered one of the four great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. That assessment came not from modern historians, but from a Persian prophet named Mani, writing in the 3rd century CE. And yet, outside of specialist academic circles, most people on Earth have never heard of it. Aksum was a civilization centered in the northern Ethiopian highlands, in what is now Tigray and Eritrea. It emerged as a significant regional power around the 1st century CE and reached its zenith between the 3rd and 6th centuries. The Aksumites were master traders who exploited their position between Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean with extraordinary effectiveness. They controlled the port of Adulis in the Red Sea, the most important commercial harbor in East Africa, through which ivory, gold, and slaves flowed in exchange for textiles, iron, and wine from the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Aksumite merchants traded with India and Sri Lanka. Their coinage was minted in gold, silver, and bronze, and is found in archaeological sites across the Arabian Peninsula. In 350 CE, the Aksumite king Izana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first states in the world to adopt it as an official religion, decades before Rome. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian denominations on earth, traces its institutional origin to this moment. At the peak of its power, the Aksumite Empire extended across the Red Sea into southern Arabia, controlling modern-day Yemen. The empire declined gradually after the 7th century as Islamic expansion reshaped the Red Sea trade routes and Aksum lost its commercial dominance. But it left behind monuments, towering stelae, some over 33 meters tall, hewn from single pieces of granite, that still stand in northern Ethiopia today, as proof that a civilization of extraordinary sophistication once commanded one of the most important crossroads on Earth. In the 17th century, on the west coast of Africa, in what is now the Republic of Benin, a kingdom rose that would become one of the most militarily disciplined states in Africa and one of the most controversial. The Kingdom of Dahomey was founded around 1600 CE and rapidly became a regional power through military conquest and administrative organization. What made Dahomey singular was its military. The kingdom maintained an elite corps of female soldiers known as the Agoji, called Dahomey Amazons by European observers, who served as the king's personal bodyguard and frontline assault force. These women were professional soldiers, required to be celibate, trained from adolescence in hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, and military tactics. European officers who encountered them in battle described them as fiercer and more disciplined than the male soldiers. At the Agogi's peak in the 19th century, they numbered between 1,000 and 6,000 women, constituting up to 1/3 of the entire Dahomey military. They were not symbolic, they were the fighting core. They raided neighboring kingdoms, captured prisoners, and maintained the internal security of the state with a ferocity that made Dahomey one of the most feared powers in West Africa. Dahomey's story is complicated. The kingdom was also a significant participant in the Atlantic slave trade, raiding neighboring peoples and selling captives to European traders at the port of Ouidah. This is part of its history that cannot be omitted. By the late 19th century, however, Dahomey stood as one of the last African kingdoms actively resisting French colonial expansion. In 1890 and 1894, Dahomey fought 2 wars against France. The French, facing the Agouti in direct combat, suffered unexpected casualties. They ultimately prevailed through superior firepower. After the conquest, France dismantled the kingdom, exiled King Behenzin to Martinique, and installed a colonial administration. The story of the Agouti, women who held military office centuries before most Western nations would consider the concept, was largely omitted from colonial histories of Africa. In 1897, a British military expedition marched into the city of Benin in what is now southern Nigeria. They looted the royal palace of the Oba, seized over 3,000 brass and ivory artworks, and shipped them back to London. Those objects, now known to the world as the Benin bronzes, were sold to museums across Europe and the United States, where many of them remain to this day. The Benin Empire was founded in the 11th or 12th century CE by the Edo people under the Ogiso dynasty, and later reorganized under Oba Eware the Great in the 15th century. At its peak, the empire controlled a substantial portion of the Niger Delta region and was a major power in West African trade. The empire built one of the most sophisticated artistic traditions in world history. Benin's bronze and brass castings, produced through the lost wax technique, depicted historical events, royal ceremonies, and military campaigns with a level of anatomical detail and artistic sophistication that stunned European art history scholars when the bronzes arrived in London in 1897. Some scholars initially refused to believe they were African in origin.
The Benin court had maintained diplomatic relations with Portugal from the late 15th century. Portuguese traders and emissaries wrote detailed accounts of a prosperous, well-governed city with wide boulevards, organized markets, and a royal court of considerable ceremony. These accounts existed in Portuguese archives for centuries, largely ignored by historians who preferred to describe pre-colonial Africa as stateless and unorganized. The 1897 British punitive expedition was triggered by the killing of a British diplomatic mission that had attempted to enter Benin during a sacred ceremony against the Oba's explicit orders. The British response was disproportionate and served colonial strategic interests in the region. The kingdom was formally absorbed into British Nigeria. The bronzes, belonging to the royal collection of a sovereign state, were distributed as war spoils. As of 2024, repatriation efforts are underway, with some institutions returning pieces to Nigeria, but thousands remain in foreign collections. 7 empires, 7 civilizations that built cities, forged laws, commanded armies, traded across oceans, wrote books, and shaped the world. 7 civilizations that were deliberately minimized, misattributed, or erased entirely from the version of history that was taught in schools for the better part of 3 centuries. The Mali Empire's manuscripts still survive in private Timbuktu collections, an estimated 700,000 documents slowly being digitized. The pyramids of Kush still outnumber those of Egypt. The walls of Great Zimbabwe still stand without a single drop of mortar. The stelae of Aksum still pierce the Ethiopian sky. The Benin bronzes are coming home. Erasure requires maintenance. It requires every generation to keep the lie going, to keep printing the textbooks that omit these names, to keep building museums that display stolen objects without context, to keep making films about ancient worlds that somehow contain no Africans. That maintenance is failing. Archaeologists, historians, and researchers across the world are rebuilding what was taken, and platforms like this one exist to make sure that the work reaches the people who were most robbed by the silence.
These empires were not erased because they were small or insignificant. They were erased because they were magnificent, because an honest accounting of African civilizational achievement would have made the colonial project impossible to justify. The erasure was not an accident of history. It was a policy, and policies can be reversed. If this documentary opened a door for you, do not close it. Share this video with someone who was never taught this history, because the odds are that is almost everyone you know. Subscribe, because this channel is just getting started. The empires covered today are 7 out of dozens. Every week there is more record to correct, more names to restore, more truth to put back where it belongs. The history of this world is incomplete without Africa at its center, and we intend to put it there.